In the early morning hours of July 2nd, 1961, in a quiet house in Ketchum, Idaho, one of America's greatest literary giants made a final, irreversible choice. Ernest Hemingway, the man who had stared down charging lions, survived 2 plane crashes, and walked through the smoke of 3 wars, picked up his favorite shotgun, and ended his own life. This last act, devastating in its finality, has long cast a long shadow over everything that came before it. Yet to know Hemingway only through his death is to know almost nothing about him. It is to miss the boy who grew up fishing the rivers of Michigan, the young man who bled in the trenches of Italy, the writer who redefined the English language with the fewest words possible, and the deeply broken soul hiding behind the world's most carefully constructed mask of strength. The story of Ernest Miller Hemingway begins in the most unlikely of places for a future literary rebel, the respectable, conservative suburb of Oak Park, Illinois, where he was born on July 21, 1899, into a world of Victorian propriety and middle-class moral certainty. Oak Park in the 1890s was a community that prided itself on its sobriety, its Protestant values, and its distance from the corruption and vice of nearby Chicago. It was a place where the lawns were perfectly manicured, the social hierarchies clearly defined, and the expectations for young men like Ernest were as rigid as the starched collars they wore to church every Sunday. The Hemingway household at 439 North Oak Park Avenue embodied all the contradictions that would later define Ernest's character and fuel his artistic vision. His father, Dr. Clarence Edmonds Hemingway, was a country physician who combined scientific rationality with a deep love of the natural world, teaching his children to fish, hunt, and appreciate the wilderness of northern Michigan where the family spent their summers. Clarence was a man of quiet strength and moral conviction, devoted to his medical practice and his family, yet haunted by a melancholy that would eventually consume him and cast a long shadow over his famous son's life. Grace Hall Hemingway, Ernest's mother, was a woman of artistic temperament and social ambition who had sacrificed her own dreams of an operatic career for the responsibilities of marriage and motherhood. She was a talented musician and singer who filled the house with music and culture, organizing concerts and literary evenings that exposed her children to the arts while reinforcing her own frustrated creative aspirations. Grace was a formidable personality who dominated the household through sheer force of will, creating an atmosphere of cultural refinement that both inspired and suffocated her children. The tension between his parents' different temperaments and values would profoundly influence Ernest's development as both a person and a writer. From his father, he inherited a love of nature, a respect for physical courage, and an appreciation for the simple, direct approach to life that would later characterize his prose style. From his mother, he absorbed an understanding of artistic expression and cultural sophistication, along with a complex relationship to authority and convention that would fuel his lifelong rebellion against bourgeois values and expectations. Ernest was the second of 6 children, born 18 months after his sister Marceline, with whom he shared a complicated relationship that reflected the broader dynamics of the Hemingway family. Grace insisted on dressing Ernest and Marceline as twins during their early childhood, often putting Ernest in dresses and feminine clothing that created confusion about gender roles, an identity that would echo throughout his life. This early experience of enforced femininity in a household that otherwise celebrated masculine virtues created psychological tensions that would later manifest in his obsessive pursuit of hyper-masculine activities and his complex, often troubled relationships with women. The summers that the Hemingway family spent at their cottage on Walloon Lake in northern Michigan provided Ernest with his first taste of the natural world that would become central to his identity and his art. These months, away from the constraints of Oak Park society, allowed him to develop the outdoor skills and appreciation for wilderness that would later inform some of his greatest writing. Under his father's tutelage, he learned to fish, hunt, and navigate the forests and lakes of Michigan, experiences that taught him the importance of grace under pressure. the value of skill and preparation, and the harsh beauty of nature's indifference to human desires and fears. The contrast between the civilized world of Oak Park and the primitive world of northern Michigan created a fundamental duality in Ernest's worldview that would later be reflected in his fiction's exploration of the tension between civilization and nature, culture and instinct, safety and danger. The annual migration between these two worlds taught him to see life as a series of contrasts and conflicts, a perspective that would become central to his artistic vision and his understanding of the human condition. Ernest's education at Oak Park High School provided him with his first opportunity to develop his writing skills and to rebel against the conventional expectations of his family and community. He wrote for the school newspaper and literary magazine, demonstrating an early talent for clear, direct prose that cut through pretension and artifice to reveal essential truths about human experience. His high school writing already showed signs of the spare, understated style that would later revolutionize American fiction, though it would take years of experience and experimentation for him to fully develop his distinctive voice. The decision to leave Oak Park immediately after high school graduation in 1917, rather than attending college as his parents expected, marked Ernest's first major act of rebellion against conventional expectations and his first step toward the life of adventure and artistic achievement that he craved. Instead of pursuing higher education, he took a job as a reporter for the Kansas City Star, a position that provided him with invaluable training in the craft of writing while exposing him to the harsh realities of urban life that were far removed from the sheltered world of his suburban upbringing. The 6 months that Ernest spent at the Kansas City Star were crucial to his development as a writer, as he learned the newspaper's famous style rules that emphasized brevity, clarity, and precision, principles that would later become fundamental to his literary aesthetic. The Star's style sheet demanded short sentences, vigorous English, and the elimination of unnecessary words, training that would prove invaluable when Ernest later developed his revolutionary approach to fiction writing. The newspaper work also exposed him to crime, violence, and human suffering in ways that shattered his remaining illusions about the benevolent nature of civilization and prepared him for the even harsher realities he would encounter in war. The entry of the United States into World War I in April 1917 provided Ernest with the opportunity for adventure and heroism that he had been seeking since childhood. Rejected by the US Army due to poor eyesight, he volunteered to serve as an ambulance driver with the American Red Cross in Italy, a decision that would prove to be the defining experience of his young life and the foundation for much of his later literary work. The war offered him the chance to test himself against the ultimate challenges of courage, endurance, and moral choice, while providing him with the raw material for the stories and novels that would make him famous. The journey to Italy in the spring of 1918 was Ernest's first experience of international travel and his introduction to the broader world beyond the American Midwest. The Atlantic crossing, the brief stay in Paris, and the train journey across France to Italy opened his eyes to different cultures, languages, and ways of life, while building his confidence in his ability to navigate unfamiliar situations and adapt to new circumstances. These experiences of displacement and cultural discovery would later become central themes in his fiction, as he explored the psychology of Americans abroad and the challenges of maintaining identity and values in foreign environments. The work of an ambulance driver on the Italian front was both dangerous and emotionally demanding, requiring Ernest to transport wounded and dying soldiers from the front lines to field hospitals while maintaining his composure and effectiveness under extreme stress. The daily exposure to suffering, death, and the arbitrary nature of survival in wartime provided him with profound insights into human nature and the fragility of life that would later inform his greatest literary works. The experience taught him that courage was not the absence of fear, but the ability to function effectively despite fear, a lesson that would become central to his personal code of honor and his artistic vision. The defining moment of Ernest's war experience came on July 8, 1918, when he was severely wounded by fragments from an Austrian mortar shell while distributing chocolate and cigarettes to Italian soldiers in the trenches near Fossalta di Piave. The explosion killed the soldier standing next to him and left Ernest with more than 200 pieces of shrapnel in his legs. Yet he managed to carry another wounded soldier to safety before collapsing from his own injuries. This act of heroism under fire earned him the Italian Silver Medal of Bravery and provided him with the kind of authentic war experience that would give authority and authenticity to his later writing about combat and its aftermath. The months of recovery in a Milan hospital were as important to Ernest's development as the wounding itself, as he fell in love with Agnes von Kurowski, an American nurse who was 7 years older and far more sophisticated than the teenage ambulance driver who had captured her attention. The relationship with Agnes was Ernest's first serious romantic attachment and his introduction to the complexities of adult love, desire, and heartbreak that would become central themes in his fiction. The affair provided him with insights into the psychology of relationships under stress and the ways in which war could intensify and complicate human emotions. The end of the war and Ernest's return to Oak Park in early 1919 marked the beginning of a difficult period of readjustment as he struggled to find his place in a civilian world that seemed trivial and meaningless after the intensity of his wartime experiences. The hero's welcome that he received from his hometown could not compensate for the psychological wounds that were less visible but more lasting than his physical injuries. He suffered from insomnia, nightmares, and a restless energy that made it difficult for him to settle into the conventional life that his family expected him to resume. The rejection letter that Ernest received from Agnes von Kurowski in March 1919, informing him that she had fallen in love with an Italian officer and would not be returning to America to marry him as they had planned, was a devastating blow that shattered his romantic illusions and provided him with his first experience of profound emotional loss. The betrayal, as he saw it, taught him harsh lessons about the unreliability of love and the danger of emotional vulnerability that would influence his relationships with women for the rest of his life and provide material for some of his most powerful fiction. The period between his return from the war and his departure for Paris in 1921 was marked by false starts, failed relationships, and a growing sense that he needed to escape the constraints of his family and his hometown in order to fulfill his potential as a writer and as a man. He worked briefly as a journalist in Chicago, where he met and fell in love with Hadley Richardson, a woman 8 years his senior who shared his love of literature and adventure while providing the emotional stability and financial support that would enable him to pursue his artistic ambitions. The decision to marry Hadley and move to Paris represented Ernest's final break with his conventional upbringing and his commitment to a life of artistic and personal adventure that would define the rest of his career. The young couple's departure for Europe in December 1921 marked the end of Ernest's apprenticeship and the beginning of his emergence as one of the most important writers of his generation. The boy from Oak Park was about to become a man of the world, and American literature would never be the same. The Paris that Ernest and Hadley Hemingway encountered in December 1921 was a city in the midst of cultural renaissance, a place where artists, writers, and intellectuals from around the world had gathered to create new forms of expression and to escape the moral and artistic constraints of their native countries. The City of Light in the early 1920s was cheap enough for struggling artists to survive, sophisticated enough to nurture serious artistic ambition, and cosmopolitan enough to welcome the kind of experimentation and innovation that would define the modernist movement in literature and art. The young American couple settled into a modest apartment at 74 Rue du Cardinal Lemoine on the left bank, in a neighborhood that was both bohemian and affordable, surrounded by the cafés, bookshops, and galleries that would become the centers of their social and intellectual life. The apartment was small and sparsely furnished, with no running water and minimal heat. But it provided Ernest with the quiet space he needed to write and the sense of independence that was essential to his artistic development. The simplicity of their living arrangements reflected both their limited financial resources and their commitment to prioritizing art over material comfort. Ernest's introduction to the expatriate literary community of Paris came through Sherwood Anderson, the American writer who had provided him with letters of introduction to key figures in the city's artistic circles. The most important of these introductions was to Gertrude Stein, the formidable American writer and art collector whose salon at 27 Rue de Fleurus had become the unofficial headquarters of the modernist movement in Paris. Gertrude's apartment, filled with paintings by Picasso, Matisse, and Cézanne, provided Ernest with his first exposure to the revolutionary artistic movements that were transforming European culture and challenging traditional assumptions about representation, meaning, and artistic expression. Gertrude Stein became Ernest's first important literary mentor, teaching him about the possibilities of experimental prose and the importance of developing a distinctive voice that could capture the rhythms and textures of contemporary experience. Stein's own writing, with its repetitive structures and emphasis on the sound and feel of language rather than conventional narrative development, showed Ernest new ways of thinking about prose style and the relationship between form and content. Her famous advice to "write about what you know" would become a fundamental principle of Ernest's artistic practice, though he would interpret it in ways that Stein herself might not have anticipated. The relationship between Ernest and Stein was complex and ultimately troubled, reflecting both the genuine affection and intellectual respect they felt for each other and the competitive dynamics that inevitably developed between two strong personalities with very different approaches to art and life. Stein saw herself as the discoverer and mentor of promising young writers, while Ernest chafed at being treated as a student rather than an equal. The tension between them would eventually lead to a bitter falling out, but during the early years of their friendship, Stein provided Ernest with crucial encouragement and guidance that helped him develop the confidence and technical skills necessary for his later success. Another crucial influence on Ernest's development during the Paris years was Ezra Pound, the American poet and critic who had become one of the leading figures in the modernist movement and a champion of experimental literature. Pound's apartment near the Place du Panthéon became another important gathering place for young writers and artists. And his passionate advocacy for literary innovation and his willingness to help promising writers find publishers and audiences made him an invaluable ally for someone like Ernest, who was still struggling to establish himself in the literary world. Pound's influence on Ernest was primarily technical, as he taught him about the importance of precision, economy, and clarity in prose writing. Pound's famous dictum "to make it new" encouraged Ernest to break away from conventional literary forms and to develop his own distinctive approach to storytelling, while his emphasis on the image as the fundamental unit of poetic expression helped Ernest understand how to create powerful effects through careful selection and arrangement of concrete details. The lessons that Ernest learned from Pound about the craft of writing would prove invaluable as he developed the spare, understated style that would become his trademark. The daily routine that Ernest established during his Paris years was crucial to his development as a writer, as he learned the discipline and dedication necessary for serious literary work. He would rise early each morning and walk to one of the cafés near his apartment, where he would write for several hours before the distractions of social life and domestic responsibilities could interfere with his concentration. The café provided him with the perfect writing environment, public enough to provide stimulation and energy, but anonymous enough to allow him to focus on his work without interruption. The stories that Ernest wrote during his early years in Paris showed clear evidence of his growing mastery of the short story form and his development of the distinctive style that would make him famous. Works like Up in Michigan, Out of Season, and My Old Man demonstrated his ability to create powerful emotional effects through understatement and suggestion rather than explicit description or analysis. These early stories also revealed his growing confidence in his ability to transform his personal experiences into universal artistic statements that could speak to readers who had never shared his particular adventures or challenges. The publication of Ernest's first book, 3 Stories and 10 Poems, by Robert McElman's Contact Publishing Company in 1923, marked an important milestone in his literary career. Even though the book received little attention, and sold only a few hundred copies. The slim volume established Ernest as a published author and provided him with the credibility necessary to approach more established publishers with his future work. More importantly, the experience of seeing his work in print gave him the confidence to continue developing his craft and pursuing his artistic ambitions despite the financial and emotional challenges of the writer's life. The birth of Ernest and Hadley's son, John Hadley Nicanor Hemingway, in October 1923 added new dimensions to Ernest's life and new pressures to his already challenging circumstances. The responsibility of fatherhood forced him to think more seriously about his financial situation and his prospects for supporting a family through his writing, while the experience of caring for a child provided him with new insights into the complexities of human relationships and the weight of responsibility that would later inform his fiction. The loss of Ernest's manuscripts in December 1922, when Hadley's suitcase containing virtually all of his unpublished work was stolen at the Gare de Lyon in Paris, was a devastating setback that might have ended the career of a less determined writer. The theft represented the loss of months of work and forced Ernest to begin again from scratch, but it also provided him with an opportunity to approach his material with greater maturity and technical skill. The stories that he wrote to replace the lost manuscripts were generally superior to the originals, suggesting that the disaster may have been a blessing in disguise. The publication of In Our Time by Three Mountains Press in 1924, followed by the expanded version In Our Time published by Bonney and Liveright in 1925, established Ernest as one of the most promising young writers of his generation and demonstrated his mastery of the short story form. The collection's innovative structure, which alternated between longer stories and brief interchapters that provided glimpses of war, violence, and social upheaval, created a powerful cumulative effect that captured the fragmentation and disillusionment of the post-war world. The stories in Our Time introduce many of the themes and techniques that would characterize Ernest's mature work, including his famous iceberg theory of fiction, which held that the surface elements of a story should reveal only a small portion of the whole, with the larger meaning and emotional impact remaining hidden beneath the surface. Stories like Indian Camp, The End of Something, and Big Two-Hearted River demonstrated his ability to create profound emotional effects through careful selection of concrete details and his mastery of dialogue that revealed character and advanced plot while maintaining the rhythms and authenticity of actual speech. The success of In Our Time led to Ernest's first novel contract with Scribner's, the prestigious New York publishing house that would remain his publisher for the rest of his career. The relationship with Scribner's, and particularly with his editor Maxwell Perkins, provided Ernest with the professional support and literary guidance that he needed to develop from a promising short story writer into a major novelist. Perkins's faith in Ernest's potential and his willingness to provide both editorial advice and financial support during difficult periods would prove crucial to Ernest's long-term success. The writing of The Sun Also Rises, Ernest's first novel, occupied much of 1925 and represented his attempt to capture the experience and psychology of his generation in a work of sustained narrative power. The novel drew heavily on his experiences among the expatriate community in Paris and his travels to Spain, where he had discovered his lifelong passion for bullfighting. The story of Jake Barnes, Lady Brett Ashley, and their circle of friends provided Ernest with the opportunity to explore themes of love, loss, and moral confusion in the aftermath of World War I, while demonstrating his ability to sustain his distinctive style over the length of a full novel. The publication of The Sun Also Rises in October 1926 established Ernest as a major literary figure and the unofficial spokesman for what Gertrude Stein had dubbed the lost generation of Americans who had come of age during World War I. The novel's portrayal of characters struggling to find meaning and purpose in a world that seemed to have lost its moral bearings resonated with readers who had experienced similar disillusionment and confusion in the aftermath of the war. The book's commercial and critical success provided Ernest with the financial security and professional recognition that he had been seeking since his arrival in Paris. The personal cost of Ernest's literary success became apparent in the deterioration of his marriage to Hadley. As the pressures of fame, financial stress, and his growing involvement with Pauline Pfeiffer, a wealthy American journalist who had become part of their social circle, created tensions that ultimately proved insurmountable. The affair with Pauline represented Ernest's first major betrayal of someone who had supported and believed in him during his struggling years, establishing a pattern of romantic restlessness and emotional cruelty that would characterize his relationships with women throughout his life. The divorce from Hadley in 1927 was a painful and guilt-ridden process that left Ernest with a sense of moral failure that would haunt him for years to come. Hadley's generosity in the divorce settlement, which gave Ernest the rights to The Sun Also Rises and other works that she might have claimed, demonstrated the depth of her love and her continued faith in his artistic potential, even as their marriage was ending. The end of his first marriage marked the conclusion of Ernest's apprenticeship as a writer and the beginning of a new phase of his career characterized by greater commercial success, but also greater personal complexity and moral ambiguity. The Paris years had transformed Ernest from an ambitious but unproven young writer into one of the most important literary voices of his generation. The city had provided him with the cultural sophistication, artistic inspiration, and professional connections necessary for his development, while the expatriate community had offered him the intellectual stimulation and creative freedom that he needed to develop his distinctive voice and vision. The experiences of these years, the friendships and rivalries, the artistic discoveries and personal betrayals, the financial struggles and creative breakthroughs, would provide material for his writing for the rest of his career and establish the foundation for his enduring reputation as one of the masters of modern American literature. The move to Key West, Florida, in 1928 marked the beginning of a new chapter in Ernest Hemingway's life, one that would see him evolve from a promising young novelist into a literary celebrity and cultural icon whose influence extended far beyond the world of literature. The small island community at the southernmost tip of the United States provided Ernest with the perfect combination of isolation and accessibility, allowing him to focus on his writing while maintaining connections to the broader world of publishing, journalism, and international affairs that increasingly demanded his attention. Key West in the late 1920s was a sleepy fishing village and naval base that had not yet been discovered by the tourists and developers who would later transform it into a major resort destination. The island's remote location, tropical climate, and laid-back atmosphere appealed to Ernest's desire for escape from the pressures and complications of his increasingly public life, while its proximity to Cuba and the Caribbean opened up new possibilities for adventure and exploration that would enrich both his personal experience and his literary imagination. The house at 907 Whitehead Street that Ernest and his new wife Pauline purchased in 1931 became the first permanent home that Ernest had owned since leaving Oak Park, and it provided him with the stability and comfort necessary for sustained creative work. The Spanish colonial mansion, built in 1851, was one of the finest houses in Key West, with high ceilings, wraparound porches, and lush tropical gardens that created an atmosphere of gracious living that was far removed from the bohemian simplicity of his Paris years. The house also featured a separate writing studio where Ernest could work without interruption, a luxury that he had never before enjoyed. The Key West years were marked by extraordinary productivity, as Ernest wrote some of his most important and enduring works, including A Farewell to Arms, Death in the Afternoon, Green Hills of Africa, To Have and Have Not, and many of his finest short stories. The combination of domestic stability, financial security, and creative freedom that he enjoyed during this period allowed him to take greater artistic risks and to explore new themes and techniques while refining the distinctive style that had made him famous. A Farewell to Arms, published in 1929, represented Ernest's most ambitious and successful novel to date, drawing on his wartime experiences in Italy to create a love story that was both deeply personal and universally resonant. The novel's portrayal of the relationship between Frederick Henry and Catherine Barclay against the backdrop of World War I demonstrated Ernest's growing mastery of character development and his ability to integrate personal and political themes in ways that enhanced rather than diminished the emotional impact of his story. The critical and commercial success of A Farewell to Arms established Ernest as one of the leading novelists of his generation and provided him with the financial resources to pursue his interests in travel, adventure, and the outdoor activities that were becoming increasingly important to his sense of identity and purpose. The novel's exploration of themes of love, war, death, and the search for meaning in an apparently meaningless universe would become central to Ernest's artistic vision and would influence countless other writers who sought to capture the experience of modern life in fiction. The development of Ernest's passion for deep-sea fishing during the Key West years provided him with both a source of personal satisfaction and a rich vein of material for his writing. The waters around Key West and the nearby dry Tortugas offered some of the finest sport fishing in the world, and Ernest threw himself into the pursuit of marlin, tarpon, and other game fish with the same intensity and dedication that he brought to his writing. The skills and knowledge that he acquired as an angler would later inform some of his greatest work, including The Old Man and the Sea. The purchase of his fishing boat, the Pilar, in 1934 represented a major investment in his new passion and provided him with the means to explore the waters of the Caribbean and the Gulf of Mexico in search of both fish and adventure. The boat, a 38-foot Wheeler cabin cruiser, became Ernest's most prized possession and a symbol of his independence and his commitment to living life on his own terms. The Pilar would serve not only as a fishing platform but also as a means of escape from the pressures of fame and a mobile base for the kind of adventures that fed his imagination and his need for authentic experience. Ernest's growing interest in bullfighting, which had begun during his travels in Spain in the 1920s, deepened during the Key West years as he made repeated trips to Spain to study the art and culture of the corridor. His fascination with bullfighting went beyond mere spectacle to encompass what he saw as the essential drama of life and death, courage and fear, that was played out in the bullring. The matador's ability to face death with grace and skill became for Ernest a metaphor for the kind of courage and authenticity that he sought in both life and art. Death in the Afternoon, published in 1932, was Ernest's attempt to capture the essence of bullfighting and to explain its significance to American readers who might not understand its cultural and artistic importance. The book combined technical analysis of bullfighting technique with philosophical reflections on death, courage, and the nature of art, creating a unique work that was part instruction manual, part cultural criticism, and part personal meditation. While the book was not a commercial success, it demonstrated Ernest's willingness to experiment with different forms of non-fiction writing and his commitment to exploring subjects that genuinely interested him regardless of their popular appeal. The African safari that Ernest and Pauline undertook in 1933 to 1934 provided him with new experiences and new material that would influence his writing for years to come. The trip to Kenya and Tanzania was Ernest's first visit to Africa, and it awakened in him a lifelong love for the continent and its wildlife that would draw him back repeatedly in later years. The safari also provided him with the opportunity to test himself against some of the world's most dangerous game and to experience the kind of primitive conditions and physical challenges that he believed were essential for maintaining his edge as both a man and a writer. Green Hills of Africa, published in 1935, was Ernest's attempt to write a completely factual account of the safari experience without resorting to the fictional techniques that he had used in his novels and short stories. The book was an experiment in what he called the fourth dimension of prose, an attempt to capture the immediacy and authenticity of lived experience through careful attention to concrete details and the elimination of literary artifice. While the book received mixed reviews and modest sales, it represented an important step in Ernest's development as a writer and his ongoing exploration of the relationship between fact and fiction, experience and art. The Spanish Civil War, which began in 1936, provided Ernest with the opportunity to return to his role as a war correspondent and to witness firsthand the kind of political and military conflict that had always fascinated him. His coverage of the war for the North American Newspaper Alliance allowed him to combine his professional skills as a journalist with his personal commitment to the Republican cause, which he saw as a struggle between democracy and fascism that would determine the future of Europe and the world. The experiences of the Spanish Civil War would provide Ernest with the material for what many critics consider his finest novel, For Whom the Bell Tolls. But they also introduced new complications into his personal life through his relationship with Martha Gellhorn, the ambitious young war correspondent who would become his third wife. The affair with Martha represented another betrayal of a loyal and supportive wife, as Ernest's marriage to Pauline began to deteriorate under the pressures of his increasing fame, his restless need for new experiences, and his growing dissatisfaction with domestic life. The Key West years had established Ernest as not only a major literary figure, but also a celebrity whose personal life and public pronouncements were followed with intense interest by the media and the reading public. His distinctive appearance, the beard, the fishing clothes, the aura of masculine adventure made him instantly recognizable, while his willingness to express strong opinions on everything from politics to literature to the proper way to mix a daiquiri made him a favorite subject for journalists and magazine writers. The transformation of Ernest from a serious writer into a public personality created new pressures and temptations that would increasingly complicate his life and his work. The demands of celebrity, the interviews, the public appearances, the constant scrutiny of his personal life took time and energy away from his writing while creating expectations and obligations that sometimes conflicted with his artistic goals. The tension between his public image as Papa Hemingway and his private identity as a serious artist would become one of the central challenges of his later career. The end of the Key West period was marked by the breakdown of Ernest's marriage to Pauline and his growing involvement with Martha Gellhorn, who represented a new type of woman in his life, independent, professionally accomplished, and unwilling to subordinate her own ambitions to his needs and desires. The relationship with Martha would prove to be both stimulating and destructive, as her competitive nature and professional success challenged Ernest's assumptions about gender roles and domestic arrangements, while providing him with intellectual companionship and shared adventures that enriched his experience and his writing. The move to Cuba in 1940 marked the beginning of what would prove to be the longest and most complex period of Ernest Hemingway's life, spanning 2 decades that would see him reach the pinnacle of literary achievement, while simultaneously beginning the slow descent into the personal and professional difficulties that would ultimately destroy him. The Finca Vigia, the hilltop estate outside Havana that Ernest purchased with Martha Gellhorn, provided him with a new base of operations that was both exotic enough to satisfy his need for adventure and accessible enough to maintain his connections to the American literary and publishing world. Cuba in the 1940s was a country in transition, caught between its colonial past and its uncertain future. A place where American influence was pervasive, but where a distinctly Cuban culture continued to flourish beneath the surface of modernization and foreign investment. The island's proximity to the United States made it an ideal refuge for Americans seeking escape from the constraints and pressures of life at home, while its tropical climate, relaxed social atmosphere, and relatively low cost of living attracted artists, writers, and adventurers from around the world. The Finca Vigia itself was a substantial property that reflected Ernest's growing wealth and status as one of America's most successful writers. The main house, built in the Spanish colonial style, sat on 15 acres of lush tropical landscape that included gardens, a swimming pool, and a tennis court, while the property's elevated position provided spectacular views of Havana and the surrounding countryside. The estate also included quarters for the staff of Cuban servants who maintained the property and catered to Ernest's needs, allowing him to live in a style that was both comfortable and authentically Cuban, The writing studio that Ernest established at the finca became the creative center of his mature career, the place where he would write some of his most important and enduring works. The room was spartanly furnished with a standing desk where Ernest preferred to work, surrounded by the books, manuscripts, and memorabilia that documented his literary career and his wide-ranging interests. The studio's isolation from the main house provided him with the quiet and privacy necessary for sustained creative work, while its windows offered views of the tropical landscape that inspired and refreshed him during long writing sessions. The relationship with Martha Gellhorn that had brought Ernest to Cuba was both the most intellectually stimulating and the most professionally challenging of his marriages. Martha was an accomplished journalist and war correspondent in her own right, with a career that had taken her to conflicts around the world and a reputation for courage and integrity that rivaled Ernest's own. Her independence and professional success represented a new type of partnership for Ernest, one based on mutual respect and shared interests rather than the traditional model of male dominance and female subordination that had characterized his previous marriages. The collaboration between Ernest and Martha as war correspondents during World War II provided them with shared experiences and professional challenges that strengthened their relationship while also creating new sources of tension and competition. Their coverage of the war in Europe and the Pacific demonstrated their individual talents while highlighting the differences in their approaches to journalism and their attitudes toward the relationship between personal involvement and professional objectivity. Ernest's coverage of World War II for Collier's magazine allowed him to witness some of the most significant events of the 20th century while providing him with material that would influence his writing for years to come. His reporting from London during the Blitz, his participation in the D-Day landings, and his presence at the liberation of Paris gave him first-hand experience of the kind of historical moments that had always fascinated him and provided him with insights into the nature of courage, sacrifice, and human endurance under extreme conditions. The experience of covering the liberation of Paris was particularly meaningful for Ernest, as it allowed him to return to the city where he had developed as a writer and to witness the end of the Nazi occupation that had transformed the cultural landscape of Europe. His emotional reunion with old friends like Sylvia Beach and his visits to familiar haunts like the Ritz Hotel and the cafés of the Left Bank provided him with a sense of continuity and completion that was deeply satisfying after the years of war and displacement. The end of World War II brought new challenges and opportunities for Ernest as he struggled to adapt to peacetime conditions while dealing with the personal and professional pressures that had accumulated during the war years. The breakdown of his marriage to Martha, which had been strained by their professional competition and their different approaches to domestic life, left him once again facing the prospect of divorce and the emotional and financial complications that such a change would entail. The relationship with Mary Welsh, the Time magazine correspondent who would become Ernest's fourth and final wife, began during the war years and provided him with the emotional stability and domestic support that he needed to continue his literary work. Mary was a skilled journalist with extensive experience covering international affairs, but she was also willing to subordinate her own career to Ernest's needs and to provide him with the kind of uncritical support and admiration that he increasingly required as he aged, and his confidence in his abilities began to waver. The marriage to Mary in 1946 marked the beginning of a new phase in Ernest's life, characterized by greater domestic stability but also by growing concerns about his health, his literary reputation, and his ability to continue producing work that met the high standards he had set for himself. The couple's life at the finca was comfortable and well-ordered, with a routine that balanced Ernest's writing schedule with his interests in fishing, hunting, and socializing with the international community of expatriates who had made Cuba their home. The publication of Across the River and Into the Trees in 1950 marked a significant disappointment in Ernest's career, as the novel received harsh reviews from critics who felt that it represented a decline in his powers and a retreat into self-parody and sentimentality. The book's poor reception was a devastating blow to Ernest's confidence and his sense of his own literary worth, forcing him to confront the possibility that his best work might be behind him and that his reputation might not survive the inevitable comparisons with his earlier achievements. The crisis of confidence that followed the failure of Across the River and Into the Trees might have ended the career of a less determined writer, but Ernest responded to the setback by returning to the fundamental sources of his inspiration and the basic techniques that had made him successful. The decision to write about fishing, a subject that he knew intimately and that had always provided him with both personal satisfaction and literary material, represented a return to the authentic experience and direct observation that had characterized his best work. The Old Man and the Sea, which Ernest wrote in a burst of creative energy in 1951, represented both a return to form and a new level of artistic achievement that surprised even his most devoted admirers. The novella's simple story of an aging Cuban fisherman's struggle with a giant marlin demonstrated Ernest's continued mastery of his craft while exploring themes of age, endurance, and the relationship between man and nature that had always been central to his vision. The critical and commercial success of The Old Man and the Sea restored Ernest's reputation and provided him with the validation that he desperately needed after the disappointment of his previous novel. The book's selection by the Book of the Month Club and its serialization in Life magazine brought it to a massive audience, while its critical acclaim confirmed that Ernest remained one of America's most important writers despite the temporary setback of his previous work. The award of the Pulitzer Prize for Fiction in 1953 for The Old Man and the Sea represented the official recognition of Ernest's achievement and his status as one of the masters of American literature. The prize was particularly meaningful because it acknowledged not only the excellence of the individual work, but also Ernest's overall contribution to American letters and his influence on the development of modern fiction. The Nobel Prize in Literature, which Ernest received in 1954, represented the ultimate recognition of his achievement and his status as a writer of international significance. The prize citation, which praised his mastery of the art of narrative and his influence on contemporary style, confirmed his position among the greatest writers of the 20th century, while acknowledging the global impact of his work and his contribution to the development of modern literature. The years following the Nobel Prize were marked by declining health and growing personal difficulties that made it increasingly difficult for Ernest to maintain the level of productivity and quality that had characterized his earlier career. The effects of his adventurous lifestyle, the injuries from accidents, the damage from years of heavy drinking, the psychological toll of his wartime experiences, began to accumulate and to interfere with his ability to work and to enjoy life. The Cuban Revolution of 1959 and the rise of Fidel Castro created new uncertainties about Ernest's future in Cuba and his ability to maintain the lifestyle that he had enjoyed for nearly 2 decades. While Ernest initially supported the revolution and maintained friendly relations with the new government, the increasing tensions between Cuba and the United States made his position as an American resident of Cuba increasingly complicated and potentially dangerous. The decision to leave Cuba in 1960 marked the end of an era in Ernest's life and the beginning of his final decline. The Finca Vigia had been more than just a home. It had been the center of his creative life and the symbol of his success and independence. The loss of this refuge, combined with his declining health and growing depression, created a sense of displacement and despair that would prove impossible to overcome. The Cuba years had seen Ernest reach the heights of literary achievement and international recognition, while also beginning the descent into the personal and professional difficulties that would ultimately destroy him. The 2 decades at the Finca had produced some of his greatest work and had established his reputation as one of the most important writers of his generation. But they had also revealed the costs of his lifestyle and the psychological pressures that came with fame and success. The man who had once seemed invincible was beginning to show signs of the vulnerability and mortality that he had spent his life trying to deny. The final years of Ernest Hemingway's life were marked by a precipitous decline that was as dramatic and tragic as anything he had ever written in his fiction. The man who had once embodied vitality, courage, and creative power found himself increasingly trapped by failing health, psychological torment, and the growing realization that his legendary strength and abilities were abandoning him when he needed them most. The last chapter of his life would prove to be a devastating demonstration of the fragility of human existence and the ultimate powerlessness of even the strongest individuals against the forces of age, illness, and despair. The departure from Cuba in 1960 was more than just a change of residence. It represented the loss of the last stable foundation in Ernest's increasingly chaotic life. The Finca Vigia had been his sanctuary for 20 years, the place where he had written his greatest works and lived according to his own rules and desires. The political upheaval in Cuba and the deteriorating relationship between the Castro government and the United States made it impossible for him to remain on the island, forcing him to abandon not only his home but also his extensive library, his manuscripts, and the countless personal possessions that had accumulated over 2 decades of residence. The move to Ketchum, Idaho, was intended to provide Ernest with a new base of operations and a return to the kind of outdoor lifestyle that had always been central to his identity and well-being. The small mountain town offered excellent hunting and fishing opportunities, while its remote location promised the privacy and tranquility that Ernest increasingly craved, as his fame made it difficult for him to move freely in more populated areas. The house that he and Mary purchased was comfortable and well-appointed, with spectacular views of the surrounding mountains and easy access to the wilderness areas where Ernest hoped to recapture some of his former vitality and enthusiasm. However, the change of location could not address the fundamental problems that were destroying Ernest's health and happiness. The physical injuries that he had accumulated over a lifetime of adventure and risk-taking had begun to take their toll, creating chronic pain and mobility problems that made it difficult for him to engage in the outdoor activities that had always been his primary source of pleasure and renewal. The effects of decades of heavy drinking had damaged his liver and other organs, while the psychological trauma of his wartime experiences and personal losses had created a depression that was becoming increasingly difficult to manage. The most devastating aspect of Ernest's decline was the deterioration of his ability to write, the one constant in his life that had sustained him through every crisis and challenge he had faced. The man who had once been able to produce clean, powerful prose with apparent effortlessness found himself struggling to complete even simple sentences. Tormented by doubts about his abilities and paralyzed by the fear that his creative powers had permanently abandoned him. The unfinished manuscripts that accumulated on his desk became symbols of his failure and sources of additional anguish as he confronted the possibility that his career as a writer was effectively over. The paranoid delusions that began to manifest themselves during Ernest's final years were perhaps the most tragic aspect of his decline, as they represented the breakdown of the rational, analytical mind that had been one of his greatest assets as both a writer and a person. He became convinced that he was being followed by FBI agents, that his phone was tapped, and that various government agencies were conspiring to destroy him. While some of these fears may have had a basis in reality, the FBI did maintain a file on Ernest due to his political activities and his residence in Cuba. The extent of his paranoia far exceeded any reasonable assessment of the actual threats he faced. The medical treatment that Ernest received during his final years was well-intentioned but ultimately inadequate to address the complex combination of physical and psychological problems that were destroying his health. The electroshock therapy that he underwent at the Mayo Clinic was a standard treatment for severe depression at the time, but it had the devastating side effect of damaging his memory and further impairing his ability to write. The loss of his memories, which had been the raw material for his fiction, was perhaps the cruelest blow of all for a writer whose work had always been based on the transformation of personal experience into art. The relationship with Mary during Ernest's final years was marked by both devotion and desperation as she struggled to care for a man who was becoming increasingly difficult and unpredictable. Mary's loyalty and dedication during this period were remarkable as she dealt with Ernest's mood swings, his paranoid accusations, and his growing inability to function normally while trying to maintain some semblance of normal life and to protect him from the public scrutiny that his condition would have attracted. The suicide attempts that preceded Ernest's final act were clear warnings of his deteriorating mental state and his growing desperation, but they were also consistent with his lifelong belief that individuals should have the right to control their own destiny and to choose the manner and timing of their death. The man who had always prided himself on his courage and his refusal to accept defeat was facing the ultimate test of his principles as he confronted the prospect of continued decline and the loss of everything that had made life worth living. The morning of July 2, 1961, began like many others in the Hemingway household with no obvious indication that it would be Ernest's last day on Earth. He rose early, as was his habit, and went downstairs to the gun room where he kept his collection of hunting rifles and shotguns. The weapon he chose was a double-barreled shotgun that he had used for hunting birds, a tool that had once brought him pleasure and satisfaction, but that would now serve a very different purpose. The sound of the gunshot that ended Ernest Hemingway's life echoed through the quiet house and across the peaceful valley, marking the end of one of the most remarkable and influential careers in American literature. The man who had lived so intensely and had written so powerfully about the human condition had chosen to end his story on his own terms, refusing to accept the continued deterioration of his abilities and the loss of his independence and dignity. The immediate aftermath of Ernest's death was marked by confusion and denial, as Mary and the local authorities struggled to come to terms with what had happened and to decide how to present the tragedy to the public. The initial reports described the death as accidental, a story that was maintained for several years until the truth about Ernest's suicide became widely known and accepted. The reluctance to acknowledge the suicide reflected both the social stigma attached to such deaths and the desire to protect Ernest's reputation and legacy from the potential damage that might result from the revelation of his final act. The funeral services for Ernest Hemingway were simple and dignified, reflecting his own preferences and his family's desire for privacy during their time of grief. He was buried in the Ketchum cemetery, in a grave marked by a simple headstone that bore his name and dates without elaborate decoration or lengthy inscription. The simplicity of the burial was appropriate for a man who had always valued authenticity and directness over pretension and artifice. The public reaction to Ernest's death was one of shock and sadness, as readers around the world mourned the loss of a writer who had profoundly influenced their understanding of literature and life. The tributes that poured in from fellow writers, critics, and ordinary readers testified to the impact that Ernest's work had had on countless individuals and to the sense of personal loss that many felt at his passing. The man who had seemed larger than life had proven to be as mortal and vulnerable as anyone else, a realization that added poignancy to the grief felt by those who had admired him. The legacy that Ernest Hemingway left behind was complex and multifaceted, encompassing not only his literary achievements, but also his influence on popular culture and his role as a symbol of American masculinity and adventure. His novels and short stories continue to be read and studied by new generations of readers who found in his work insights into the human condition that remained relevant and powerful decades after their creation. His distinctive prose style influenced countless other writers who sought to emulate his economy and precision, while his approach to character and theme established new possibilities for American fiction. The personal example that Ernest had set through his lifestyle and his public persona also continued to influence people long after his death, inspiring some to seek the kind of authentic, adventurous existence that he had embodied while warning others about the dangers of pursuing such a life without adequate attention to its psychological and physical costs. The tragedy of his final years served as a reminder that even the strongest and most accomplished individuals are vulnerable to the forces of age, illness, and despair, and that the pursuit of an authentic life requires not only courage and determination, but also wisdom and self-knowledge. The questions raised by Ernest's life and death, about the relationship between art and experience, about the costs of fame and success, about the nature of courage and authenticity, continue to resonate with readers and writers who struggle with similar challenges in their own lives. His example remains both inspiring and cautionary, demonstrating the heights that human creativity and determination can reach, while also revealing the depths to which even the most gifted individuals can fall when they lose their way or their sense of purpose. The man who had once written that the world breaks everyone, and afterward many are strong at the broken places, had ultimately been broken himself, unable to find the strength to continue fighting against the forces that were destroying him. Yet his work endures as a testament to the power of human creativity and the importance of facing life's challenges with courage and honesty, even when the outcome is uncertain and the costs are high. Ernest Hemingway's final act may have been one of defeat, but his life's work remains a victory for the human spirit and a lasting contribution to our understanding of what it means to be fully alive.